Just doing all my social media stuff, just getting all that ready. Okay, now that I got all that. Starting a little bit late. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna make you guys wait a little bit longer. I'm just gonna grab myself a drink so that I have something to sip on while I read. So I'll be right back before we start. It is important to stay hydrated. Clearly, I needed that before we started because we be fumbling all over words today. Okay. Hello and welcome to the streaming Parson reads the Book of Genesis. It's been a while since I've done one of these. Just been swamped with all kinds of crazy obligations and work and stuff like that. And I haven't had a chance to actually do one of these in a while. So I will do a fair amount of review today because today's reading I'll start from Genesis chapter 20. And if I go according to my schedule and read about 4 chapters, we'll actually finish one of the big arcs in Genesis, the Abraham arc, as I like to call it. And I think the Abraham arc has a lot of interesting dynamics to it. And because the Abraham arc actually has very interesting themes in it that you normally don't get covered in a Sunday school sort of class, I will do a fair amount of review of the rest of the Abraham arc. So from chapter 12 to up to speed, basically. And I will do a fair amount of review for that. So if you have questions and if I'm jumping over some details that you might have missed, and you know, we're in the middle of a stream right now, so you can't go and watch the previous stuff to get caught up, you know, just ask me and I'll do my best to answer your question. With that being said, I'm just going to start us off with a word of prayer and then we'll dive right into it. Lord God, we thank you for this day and we thank you for this time that we have to read through your word. And I just pray that as we read through Genesis today, that you would show yourself to us and reveal your desires in our life. I just pray in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. All right. So, I'm just going to dive right into... Well, actually, no, I'm not going to dive right into reading. I'm going to do a little bit of review first. So, Abraham, or Abram as his name started out as, he lived in this like town, I guess, called Ur. And then he moved for a little while with his dad because his dad was like, yo, let's go like traveling in my last days. So they end up in this place called Haran. And that's where Abraham's dad, Terah dies there. And so Abram's kind of out of a loss because I kind of suggested, well, I didn't just suggest, I made the claim that Abram was actually kind of like a failure in life. You know, he's like 70 years old. You know, him and his wife still live with his dad, basically. He has no kids. He doesn't have much wealth of his own. So basically, he's at a loss when his dad dies in Haran. And while he's kind of hanging out in Haran, God's like, yo, I'm going to take you to this place, all right? So you just trust me. I'm going to lead you to this new place. And Abram's like, okay, I guess I got nothing better to do. So Abram takes his wife and, of course, his nephew, Lot, and they go traveling for a while. Basically, early part of their travels, there's a famine in Abram's homeland. So Abram actually goes to Egypt. And there he kind of like lies his way out of trouble because he's like all worried that because his wife is, despite the fact she's super old, like she's like 60 at the time, she's still super attractive. But I guess, I mean, that would be a life goal for anybody to still be super hot at the age of 60. But basically at the age of 60, Abram's like, yo, pretend you're my sister so people won't kill me just to have you. So they live in Egypt for a while, and Abram pretends that Sarah, his wife, is actually his sister. And the Pharaoh of Egypt is like, yo, that chick's super hot. I want to marry her. So basically, the Pharaoh sets up arrangements to marry Sarai, but God's like, nope, not having this. So Pharaoh gets like some kind of curse in his house, and he's basically like, yo, Abram, what the hell, man? Like, why'd you lie to me? Get the hell out of my house. I'll buy you out. And so like Abram actually acquires a lot of wealth. And this is actually very interesting. This is actually very important to point out because Abram now has something to his name, even though he more or less stole it in a way. I mean, he didn't exactly steal it. The Pharaoh of Egypt bought him out so he would get out of his house. But so basically the reason why this is important is because Abram has a lot of wealth, and that includes livestock, and this ends up conflicting with his nephew. Now, his nephew Lot apparently has his own wealth, his own cattle and his own stuff, and so because they have too much stuff between them, they have to split up. And so Abram goes to what is essentially like the land of Canaan and most of modern East Israel. I was thinking myself, I was like, was it east or west side of Israel? East Israel, and like part of Iraq. And Abram kind of walks around there for a while, and God's like, "Yo, I'm gonna give this land to you." And then Lot moves more to the water side, and that's where Sodom and Gomorrah are. So time passes, and basically God's like, "Yo, I'm gonna make you a deal. I'm gonna make you this big promise, okay? And the big promise is that you're gonna have a son, and this son will be the inheritor of your wealth, and he will be the one to carry your name, because of course that's important in ancient cultures, and it's still kind of important today. So Abram, of course, is just like, this is crazy, right? Like, I'm an old fart. There's no way I'm gonna have kids at my old ass age. And God's like, just trust me on it. In due time, you will have a son. And God even makes him like this huge proclamation. He talks about how like, yo, you're not just gonna have a son, but that son of yours is gonna have so many offspring that you won't be able to count them. Like if you could, let's see you try and count the stars. And if you could do that, that's how many descendants you'll have, which basically like God's kind of trolling them. But at the same time, it's God making a pretty big statement about how, God is going to do something big in Abram's life, right? Then there's this part where in chapter 15, I'm just jumping through the chapters here. Chapter 15 is where they kind of make like a business deal contract, if you will. in like a ancient Middle Eastern style, where basically they cut up an animal and then like they're supposed to burn the animal parts. That's kind of like the sealing of our deal. It's kind of how ancient people did things, I guess. So basically, God seals his deal, like as if God has to keep his word. But I mean, it's part of his character that he would. But he decides to play along with human tradition, and I think that's also an interesting thing to point out because despite the fact that like God is a God being God and all that, he would be above the need of participating in human rituals, but he does it anyway because the point I want to get at is that God humanizes Abram. And then by extension, this is important for us to read as moderns, that God humanizes us, right? Because it's hard to think about like, okay, if God is like all powerful and he's like, creator of the universe, he's all good, he's all that thing, right? Like what would a God like that want to do with, some little shit like me, basically? And so, but and that's a legitimate question to ask, but I think when you read Genesis and you understand this, when God humanizes Abram in participating in very human activities, even though clearly God is above that and wouldn't have to. And it's interesting because other parts of the Bible point out that God could have done things because he can. So, for example, there's one part where in the New Testament it talks about how, God can make an oath on his word alone. He doesn't need anything else because he's God. Why would he need anything else? God only needs to testify to himself. And so that's now some people may think, well, that's a contradiction then, but not really, right? Because in the New Testament, it's pointing out that Jesus is still able to behave this way, but he doesn't, which is interesting to think about because God doesn't behave this way. It's meant to make God able to be related to, because of course that's you know the one of the major themes of Judeo-Christianity is that God is not just some impersonal force, but he is a person, right? And that's why we also use pronouns with him, right? We refer to God as he. He's a person. He's not just something. And so that's a very interesting thing to point out in chapter 15 that I thought was a big deal about it. So after chapter 15, God sets up this whole like, yo, I'm gonna make you have like descendants and all that stuff. And the next chapter, Abram's wife, Sarai, she comes up with this brilliant plan to like, yo, we can make God's promise happen. Here, take my maidservant, Hagar, and have a kid with her. And then this is where Abraham's first son, Ishmael, is born, and Ishmael's a really good character, and Hagar's actually an interesting character to study. But you can watch the past streams for my analysis on her. And then basically after that, God's like, yo, what the heck, man? Like, this is not how I said it was gonna go down. Like, I told you that you and your wife Sarai will have a son. Okay? Now let's try this again. And now your name is Abraham, and your wife's name is Sarah. Now let's do a take two. Now, some years later, because Ishmael grows up, well, doesn't grow up, he's like a teenager. And Abraham's like 90 something years old, as the Bible would tell us. And God visits Abraham again. He's like, yo, remember when I told you, like a couple of years back, that like you and Sarai are gonna have a son? Yeah, what's going on, man? Like, not have enough sex or something? And so Sarai's like in the back, like kind of laughing about it, like this is ridiculous, right? Like, how could Abram and I have a son? Like, we're so old, like that's not gonna happen. And then of course, God's like, why did you think that was funny? Like, I'm dead serious about this promise. Then God leaves, and then of course the Sodom and Gomorrah story happens where he's like, all right, I gotta go check this place out, and then he blows it up. So that's the summary of the Abraham arc. Oh, the reason why the Sodom and Gomorrah thing is important to bring up is because there's a scene where Abraham actually tries to bargain with God. And this scene is actually important as well because it's more of God humanizing Abram, despite that. Chapter 18 is a great read because Abram's kind of described as being an idiot, but he's not stupid because he's stupid. He's stupid because, like, he does typical guy things and it's laughable at times. But, I mean, to be fair, in the same chapter, Sarah is contrasted with him as also being kind of silly. You know, typical man and woman issues, right? Like, Abraham acts without thinking, which is shown in, like, his bargaining scene with God. Like, he tries to bargain with God. Like, you can actually bargain with God. And of course, Sarai's disbelief comes from overthinking. You know, the typical guy problem of acting without thinking, and typical woman problems of not acting because of overthinking. Right? So the scene of Sodom and Gomorrah is interesting because it's a contrast between God, who humanizes two idiots basically, and Sodom and Gomorrah, a town full of people who don't humanize, you know, the stranger, which is an important thing to think about every time you think of, you know, when God commands the Israelites to love your neighbor. Okay, that was a mouthful for review. If you want some details and, you know, some details in that, I'll try and answer them, but we also want to move forward. I will be reading at least 4 chapters to get to the end of the Abraham arc. And then, of course, next week, assuming I stream, I have time for a reading stream next week. I'll try to do it. Next week we'll start Isaac arc, which is the next part, because Abraham will, you know, he's already super old as is, and he's gonna die off. So the Isaac arc will be next week. But today we're gonna try and finish the Abraham arc, and that's the agenda for today's stream. I felt like I had to do the review because it has been a few weeks, excuse me, since I've done the last reading stream. Another funny thing too is just that I wanted to do the review because I wanted to bring up something that happens at the beginning of the Abraham arc, which will actually happen again, basically as I start reading. So keep that in mind. Chapter 20. Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Greer, and there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." Then Abimelech, king of Greer, sent for Sarah and took her to be his wife. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, "You are as good as dead, because of the woman you have taken is a married woman." Now Abimelech had not gone near her. So he said to the Lord, so he said, "O God, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, 'She is my sister'? And didn't she also say, 'He is my brother'? I have done this with clear conscience and clean hands." Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all who belong to you will die." So early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials. And when he told them all that had happened, they were very much afraid, as well as they should be. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said, "What the hell have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my house? You have done things to me that should never be done." And Abimelech asked Abraham, "What was your reasoning for doing this?" Abraham replied, I said to myself, 'There is surely no fear of God in this place. and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. More of this hint that Abraham's kind of a failure in the family. He can't meet out a woman normally, so he has to basically rearrange with his like half sister. But they're actually more cousins, as we'll get to later. Because the Bible will some people think it's a contradiction, but they're more like cousins than like siblings in that way. Like when Abraham talks about how they may have they come from the same house, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like they're actual siblings. And then of course there's that later apparent contradiction that they're actually cousins, as we will meet in the Isaac arc, which I will bring up, but I wanted to make this clear and before everybody freaks out about the ridiculous amount of incest. But don't worry, there'll be more of those kind of jokes as we move along. Because, well, as Genesis will tell us, Canaan is a crazy-ass place. Anyway, verse 13. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham. And he returned Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, my land is before you. Live wherever you like. To Sarah he said, I am giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves. So Abimelech already had a wife. Douche. But I guess, polygamy was just the way things were back then. You just gotta deal with it. For the Lord had kept all the women in Abimelech's household from conceiving because of Abraham's wife Sarah. So just a little commentary on chapter 20 and to go back on the actual relationship between Abraham and Sarah. So even though one of the things that if you read Genesis at face value, you have to accept that they're actually brother and sister and husband and wife. But in a later part of Genesis, this will actually contradict itself. But it's not because the Bible contradicts itself, but there's actually a bigger problem here. And I guess you could argue that the contradiction would be what God tells Abimelech about how Abraham is a prophet. But at the same time, it's pretty clear, just like in chapter 12 and in other parts of the Abraham arc, Abraham, like a lot of guys, he's a big liar. And Abraham he continuously lies to get himself out of trouble, right? Because that's kind of the kind of person that he is. And this is, it's really interesting to think about how, Abraham is supposed to be like the start of the Hebrew people, by having Isaac. But it really shows that, one of the major themes of the Bible is not about the people. I mean, the people are there so that, one, we as modern readers can relate to them. But two, they're meant to be the instruments of showing how good and how loving and how, merciful and all the other attributes of God, how God behaves, who God is, right? That's the whole point. So more often than not, when you read through with a lot of these characters in the Bible, they're actually really crappy human beings. But of course, we must always keep in mind it's not about them. It's about what God is able to do and how God can do good things with bad people. And if you read the Bible honestly like that, it actually answers one of the big questions when it comes to suffering, right? Where many people wrongly ask, why do bad things happen to good people? But that's not the right question to ask, because the assumption is that this world, you know, evil is not generated by people. That's what it assumes when you ask that kind of question. But the biblical worldview is that, well, no, that's far from the case. People are quite capable of so much evil. And so the real question is, why do good things happen to bad people? Because basically everybody is bad in some way or another. Now, I know you might be thinking that, like, well, I, do good things, and I'm not an asshole to my neighbor. I don't cheat on my wife. I'm not a killer. I don't beat kids. I'm a good guy. I don't cheat my taxes or whatever. But you might be the exception. I mean, if you're Mr. Perfect, you might be the exception. And one of the funny things is that Saint Paul, kind of uses that same argument. He's like, yeah, well, I used to think I was the exception. But even a person who believes they can do all the good that they do, you'd be foolish to not think that the world is full of bad people and that people are very capable of great evil. And even if you are a person who does good, you're a good person, you're still quite capable of becoming a very evil person pretty quickly. And so the contrast that the Bible is getting at is that the Bible is going to make the basic assumption that, well, since we're all very capable of great evil, we're all pretty bad at base, right? At face value, we're all pretty bad people, and that's a fair assumption to make. We all do a lot of bad things. But then it brings up that question, well, why do good things happen to bad people? And the Bible's answer for that is how good God is, and that is how much he loves you, that he will still be good to you even though you're bad. Of course, the book of Romans uses the famous line, while we were still sinners, God died for us. And so, of course, the book of Romans is like thousands of years later from Genesis, but that's the idea. And the beauty of reading Genesis is that you can see this as early as Genesis, that despite that we're sinners and we're bad people, God loves us. And I've mentioned this several times already about how God humanizes us even though we're bad people, right? Even though, yes, God wants us to change and he wants to purify us of our evil, but at the same time, let's put it this way. If you're gonna, you can't just, if you're gonna wash dirty clothes, you gotta touch the dirty clothes, right? Unless even if you use like a 6-foot prong or something, you still have to interact with it, and that's never fun. Well, depending how dirty it is, right? So, going back to Genesis and talk about Abraham, Abraham he's supposed to be, the founder of the Israeli people, the Hebrews who later become the Israelites. Oh, as the founder, he must be this paragon of virtue. But the Bible's like, nah, he ain't no paragon of virtue. He's a crappy human being just like the rest of you. And that's one of the beauties of when you read Genesis this way. And of course, on the flip side, you're like, well, even though he's a total mess up, well, and God still loves him, and God still, approaches him and is very close to him. Can be true in my own life too. That God can be close to me, even though I'm pretty messed up too. And so that's the beauty of the story that you're supposed to kind of see. But I wanted to point out that, this thing Abraham tells Abimelech is actually a lie. Now, I know some people might say, well, if God can't lie, then the Bible can't lie. But the Bible's not lying about the message. The lie is in what Abraham is saying, because Abraham is a liar. But in that case, if you take that statement, then the Bible's true, right? the Bible is telling you Abraham is a liar, this is what he said, that's a lie. So before some people try to get like, super like hypothetical and say, well, the Bible can't be all true because there's lies, people say lies in it. But that's not the Bible being untrue. That's the people the Bible talking about being liars. So I wanted to point out that this scene is interesting because Abraham, he still hasn't quite learned as much as he should have, despite walking around with God basically for like the better of 20 years, give or take. Since he starts at the age of like 70 and now he's like 90 something here. So he's like 20 some odd years. He's been walking around with God. But clearly, another thing that the Bible's pointing out is that, some people, they're really hard-headed and they take a long time to learn. Abraham, no exception. Like everybody else, he's pretty hard-headed. And just like back in Egypt, Abraham tries to lie his way out. Which is kind of comical to see. And of course, the being able to read the Bible, it really lets you see that, right? To see that, like, yeah, this is human beings in a nutshell. And let's be real, man to man here, right? What is the first thing you do when your wife is mad at you? You lie, right? What's the first thing you do when your boss is mad at you? You lie, right? Because that's what guys do. And so it's also kind of comical to point that out, that Abraham, that's another thing that makes him so relatable. He's your dude, bro. He's just another guy. He's nothing special in that regard. But once again, it's not about how cool Abraham could be. It's about what God can do with this filthy liar. Not much else to say about this chapter, because the focus of the chapter is Abraham being a dirty liar, and yet God is still planning to use this guy. Moving on. Chapter 21. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. I guess her old age as well. She's not that much younger than he is. And at the very time God had promised him. Now Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him, as he was told. When his son was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. When his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Now the child grew, and he was weaned. And on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham had a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking, and she said to Abraham, Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Now the matter distressed Abraham greatly, because it concerned his son. But God said to him, Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your son. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders, and then he sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bowshot away. She went off and sat down about a bowshot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of the Lord called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy cry as he lies there. Lift up the boy and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got him a wife from Egypt. Verse 22. At that time, Abimelech and I'm going to see if I can pronounce this right. Phicol. That's an awkward word to say out loud. Phicol, the commander of his forces, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. Now swear to me here before the God that you will not deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me in the country where you now reside as a foreigner the same kindness I have shown to you. I swear it, Abraham said. Then Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. But Abimelech said, I don't know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I heard about it only today. So Abraham brought sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a treaty. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs from the flock. And Abimelech said to Abraham, What is the meaning of the 7 ewe lambs you have set apart by themselves? Abraham replied, Accept these 7 lambs from my hand as a witness that I dug this well. So that place was called Beersheba, because the two men swore an oath there. After the treaty had been made at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the eternal God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for a long time. So, chapter 21. 3 events happen in it, so we're going to kind of talk about them piece by piece. So the first one is the birth of Isaac, and the Bible kind of treats it like this happened. Because, that whole promise and everything, it's got to happen at some point. So, basically, this scene is just kind of told as like, okay, this happened. And, one of the interesting things about this particular part of the passage is like, it does put a focus back on Sarah. Being the mom and all, I guess it's important. You should celebrate moms and all. So, the focus on her and how, how much pride she's gotten now that even though she's super old, she's like, well, the Bible tells you that Abraham is 100 years old. He's 100 years old when Isaac is born. So that means Sarah's like 90 years old. So she's like older than like most people's life expectancies. Now we know she's 90 because in an earlier part of the Bible, I can't remember exactly which chapter, but an earlier part actually tells you how old she is in comparison to Abraham. And you basically just do the math. So I think it was when Ishmael was born, so Abraham was like 90 years old, about 90. And then it mentions that Sarah was 80 years old at that time. So you just do the simple math and then you just add 10 years, right? And so that's also the time span that Ishmael is older now. So just a funny little thing about like how Sarah's like so just a funny observation about how like she's older than most people are expected to live and has a son. Once again, I mean this obviously shows that, God has the power to do, anything really. And by letting an old a super old woman, which on another note, I did not mention this in chapter 20 when we were talking about Abimelech, but when Abimelech saw that she was attractive, she was like almost 90 years old at that time. Like, how good must she be looking? Like, what kind of, I bet every woman would want to know the secrets that Sarah has of how she's able to maintain a youthful and sexually attractive appearance. Because that must be the case, right? It's not like people are just gonna be like, yo. I mean, maybe there are some people into that, like, going for a lady just because she's super old. But that'd be kind of, well, I don't know anyone like that. You might know someone like that, but I don't know anyone like that. But just a funny observation about like Sarah's really, really old and is able to pull off young people stuff. But I mean, Abraham was, when he was like 70 years old, he was like in a physical prime kicking all kinds of ass. So maybe in the ancient world, like 65 was like the 30 of that time. But who knows? The Bible, like obviously some of these characters, you have to assume some kind of magical nature in the world of Genesis, right? Because Genesis predates modern history for the most part. And so, like, sure, like the superpower nations, like Egypt and them were around, but it's still early in those like in those civilization primes, right? And it's still early, so it's weird to think that like people in the ancient world, and when like archaeologists talk about like how the ancient world was, and they don't possess a lot of the medicines that we have now, you wonder how people could pull off the stuff that they do. But maybe they knew stuff that we have lost and we have no idea of, that may actually be better for us for all we know. And maybe that's why these old people are able to do stuff that young people can barely do. So just an, I don't know, interesting observation. And I understand where some people have skepticisms about Genesis being a real account, because some things are kind of ridiculous. But once again, I know some people may feel this is kind of a cop out, but the Christian answer is about how, well, it's about what God can do, and God can use anyone, no matter how old and decrepit they might be. So that's Genesis 20 and the beginning of Genesis 21. The next part to talk about is the whole Hagar thing, because she's back in the story. She was around like a couple of chapters ago, and she was important because she gave birth to Abraham's first son. Which does make you wonder, what the hell was the explanation with him, right? When, let's say Abraham was moving into like the Philistine places, Philistine, let's just call it. He was moving to Philistine. And, if he was going to lie that, like, Sarah was his sister, and then I guess he would have to say that Hagar was his wife, which would have been really awkward. And then, of course, like, Ishmael was his son, so maybe, like, here's some other weird, like, and problematic parts of Abraham's life, where, like, well, if he's going to lie that his actual wife is his sister, then, like, I don't want to be mean about this, but, Hagar must not have, despite Hagar being a lot younger, she would not have been viewed as super hot or something. I don't know. Because it's not like Abraham would have been concerned about getting killed over her. But he's, like, concerned about being killed for his, like, super old wife. I don't know. Abraham's a weird dude. clearly. So, but I wonder what the explanation for like Hagar was, right? And then of course Ishmael, right? Because Ishmael was a son, and because Abraham loves him a lot, as we can see, it'd be a far-fetched claim to say that Abraham would have lied about his son's identity, right? That Ishmael is like, oh, this is my nephew or something, right? Like, I don't know, but and then who? Well, who would who his parents, right? Like, right? This is why you don't lie, right? Because then you have to come up with more lies to worm your way out of the first lie you made. But I like how it's kind of funny how the Bible kind of forgets about him for a little bit, because like maybe the rest of you don't think about this as much as I do, because clearly I think about this kind of stuff way too much. But think about like all these other factors that could go into Abraham's big lie to Abimelech, right? And why Abimelech is not more angry with him than he is. Because if I were Abimelech, I'd be super mad, right? I'd be like, get that. Well, I'd be like Pharaoh back in chapter 12, right? Like, he'd be like, get the hell out of my house. So, but I don't know. Abimelech is a much nicer guy, which is the surprise, right? Because Abraham thought that Abimelech was a pretty awful guy. Because Abraham's like, oh, I thought this place had no fear of God. But clearly Abimelech does. So Abraham was clearly wrong and tries to lie his way out of it. But going back to Hagar and Ishmael, and they're an interesting story to read. I'll turn this light off too, so I don't look like a... See, the problem with my lighting is that like if I don't have I have this lamp right here. If I don't have it on, then like it's super dark, unless I like maybe turn this one on. No, that's not. This won't really do much. See, but if I turn this one on, then it's like I look like I'm glowing. I'm sparkling. At least that's how it looks like on OBS. Sorry, that was a sidetrack. So anyways, Hagar and Ishmael are now brought back into the story. I went on that tangent because I kind of think it's funny that like the Bible kind of forgets about them for a little bit, and then you wonder like what would have happened with them in like these other scenarios that Abraham finds himself in. But so here they are, and now that Isaac is around, and Sarah's like, I don't want these two here anymore, because Sarah, I guess, is kind of petty. But the irony, of course, and why this scene is kind of stinging, and it makes Sarah look really bad, actually, is because this was actually all her fault, right? The reason why Hagar is here and has a son with, her husband, that was all her fault. So, I guess typical man and woman problems, right? Abraham lies to get himself out of trouble, and Sarah thinks she can just, get her husband to throw out, all her problems. So, typical crazy people, and not the brightest, right? But once again, it's about what God can do, not what people can do. Because clearly Abraham and Sarah, not great people. So it's funny how Sarah's like, get rid of them, even though like they're there because of her. And really it's all her fault more than anything. So Abraham's like, and this is a part where like, despite Abraham kind of being dumb as they kind of keep poking fun at him, but this scene is actually pretty great where he's like, but I don't want to, Ishmael's my son too, and I love him. And that very humanizing moment. And once again, this shows how good God is, right? Because God's like, I'll take care of them. But you might want to listen to your wife, because you're gonna run a lot of shit if you don't, right? And he's not wrong. So, but I kind of like that. It shows how kind God is, despite the craziness of ordinary people life. Even though that sounds oxymoron, right? Like a normal person's life is crazy. I mean, anyone who doesn't think their life is like all kinds of crazy and like spiraling in 50 different directions, you must live the perfect life, because us normal people go through crazy crap all the time. because that's life, right? And that's another thing about the Bible that like I wish people would appreciate more is that like some people think it's fiction because of how crazy people's lives can be. But if you're honest with yourself, it's like we all know people who have crazy ass lives because life is crazy. And so in a way the Bible is a much more humanizing story because everybody's life is more batshit crazy. And to be fair, there's a reason why you see a lot more crazy things in the Bible. It's kind of like the explanation I remember hearing was about how imagine if like well let's go with this. If the Bible is basically a compilation of historical events for the Hebrew people, right? You think of any kind of compilation of past events, and we live in 2020. You can make compilations of a crate of 1 year and make like an hour long video of like hilarious and stupid moments in 2020. You can make an hour long video of that, right? So imagine they didn't have YouTube back then, but imagine like people that heard these stories and read these old documents about like crazy events in history and then just put all the crazy events because they're more interesting to read. Because no one's going to watch a YouTube video of normal people doing normal stuff. I mean, that's probably why these reading streams don't get as many views as they do, right? No one cares about a guy doing regular stuff. Most people are going to watch YouTube for all the crazies, right? But the Bible is kind of exactly the same in that way. It's like it compiles all the crazy events because that's the stuff people want to read about, and then it's kind of formatted. The Bible's kind of formatted that way: crazy event, crazy event, crazy event, crazy event. It's one crazy event after another, and so even though like Abraham and Sarah are meant to be normal people, of course the Bible records all their crazier events and all their crazier adventures. After all, there's like a number of time skips in here too, right? Because who cares about the part when like Abraham's just sitting in front of his tent in the heat of the day, right? Like no one cares about those days. People want to see the crazy, right? People want to see Abraham try and lie his way out of, you know, getting himself killed, right? People want to see that, right? Because it's funny and it's hilarious, and we can laugh at him. And it's the same thing with like Sarah here, right? Like every time Ishmael and Hagar are brought up, it's always because Sarah has to cause a problem, right? Because Sarah is the cause of her own problems, and so the Bible kind of does this intentionally. I know I'm kind of joking about like what the hell were they doing during the Abimelech arc and whatever, but of course the reason why anytime the Bible brings up Hagar and Ishmael, it's meant to remind you that the reason why Sarah has problems, it's Sarah's own damn fault she has these problems that she does. And so it's kind of one of those twist of ironies, and it's something to always keep in mind about like when we face problems in our own life, right? Like how many of them are of our own making? Because like Abraham, we feel we have to lie to everything or whatever the reason might be. Which is ironic because Hagar is like the victim of circumstance, right? She's kind of like, I'm here because someone else says I have to be here. And so that's a mega oof for her, and now she gets kicked out, right? But I love how, God still shows how good and how loving and kind he is. When like even though God like tells Abraham to basically like, yeah, you're gonna have to do what your wife says and kick him out. But at the same time, he provides for Ishmael and Hagar. He takes care of them because you are supposed to feel bad for those two, right? Because Hagar's the victim of circumstance and Ishmael is the product of that circumstance, right? And so they're kind of like they're basically victims, and you're meant to feel bad for them, and God obviously does because he shows that he cares for them and that he loves them. And there's that whole promise about making Ishmael a great people, and many people interpret this of Ishmael being the founder of the Arab world. And of course, you see the plentiful that exists in the Arab world, right? Sure, there's some turmoil there now, but you know, a vast people, you know, descendants like the stars, if you will, right? Great wealth in the Middle East, right? And many Christians believe that, like, yeah, that's God's promise to Ishmael in a nutshell, right? The Middle East is a place of plenty because the descendants of Ishmael are now the dominant people. That's the popular biblical theory about why the Middle East is the way it is. But when you read in Genesis, you're meant to see that, like, yeah, God, does provide. And the interesting contrast as well, where Abraham can trust God when it comes to Ishmael, is because God had already carried out his promise with Isaac. Well, not fully, but God had carried out his promise in giving him a son with his wife Sarah, with Isaac. And because God had already done that, when God says, "Hey, even though you gotta listen to your wife and send Ishmael and Hagar away, I will take care of them. Like, you don't have to worry about it. I will take care of them." And once again, this just shows how good God is, right? And Abraham, he knows this, and he can trust God. And that's another funny the contrast between God and people in general, right? So Abraham he's pretty deceitful and not a nice guy, and God, on the other hand, is super nice to an undeserving liar, right? And so that's the interesting contrast you're supposed to see here. And this just brings, as you read this, you should be like in awe of how good God is, right? Because of how terrible everybody else is. Not much else to say about Ishmael. He basically becomes a great people, as God promises. And we'll actually see Ishmael one more time in the Bible, because Ishmael and Isaac will bury Abraham together. And so there's actually this interesting, like, closure to them, right? Because in a way, Ishmael is kicked out of the house, sent away from his father because of Isaac, right? Because of his half brother. But at the same time, Ishmael is not a petty little crap, right? Which is an interesting contrast. I'll talk about this when we get to it, because that's like that's like at least next week's stream, where we'll get to see Ishmael one more time, and I actually think he's an interesting character as well, even though he doesn't have a lot of scenes. But I mean, he's just meant to be like, he's this victim of circumstance, but yet at the same time, you still see how good God is and that God takes care of him. And so that's something that, I guess you can call this the pastoral moment, where, that's something you can be assured of with God, right? Even when your life feels like, oh man, like, I have no control in it and everything is just going all over the place and life is crazy. Hey, just trust in God, and he'll guide you, and he'll provide for you, and he'll care for you, because God does love and care for you. And I think that's something that, we can look at Ishmael, and that's why I actually really like Ishmael, even though he doesn't have a lot of scenes in the Bible. That's why I like him so much, because he's that perfect reminder of, yeah, God does care and love us, and he will provide for us, even when we feel like nothing is in control. Because Ishmael is that one character, even though he's like supposedly the father of like one of the greatest nations in the world, arguably. Before he was that, right? He was just the victim of circumstance, battered around left and right wherever the winds of change took him. And God took care of him. And God loves him deeply. So I actually, that's something that we can all learn from Ishmael as well. And why you should read on Ishmael's character and the short passages that he does have. Because God cares for him, just like he cares for you. Okay. The last part is just between Abraham and Abimelech again. And it's just like the founding of Well, basically the story just kind of tells you where Abraham's going to live for the next little while, because chapter 22 has a massive time jump. And I might as well just mention this, because I know as I just read through, if you just read through the chapters, you may get lost and forget that like these things happen. But I think chapter 21, verse 22 to the end of chapter 21, it's more just world building, because the Bible's prepping you for like, okay, here's kind of what happens in Abraham's life for a while, because we're going to go for a time jump. And like Abraham is like he's already old in the beginning of chapter 21, but we're going to jump like at least 15 years, give or take. Because we got a massive time jump coming up. So that's, I don't really have much to say about the last part of chapter 21. It's just telling you what Abraham does for the next number of years, because the next time we read about him in the next chapter, years have passed. So let's read chapter 22. Chapter 22. Now sometime later, God tested Abraham. God said to him, Abraham, here I am. Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Now early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey, and he took him with 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Now on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in a distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Now Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire with the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. And when they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am." "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." Any Hebrew experts, there's someone put the El whatever name in there. I forget which one it is. But there's a lot of Jewish worship songs use this name a lot. But since I'm using an English translation, it just says like the English translation as opposed to like the worship word that's often used. That like people use in like worship songs, and like he's not El Shaddai. El Shaddai is he who is powerful. So there's one of the he who provides. If there's a Hebrew expert here, put it in the chat or something. I forget what it is, but this title is actually a pretty important one. That where Abraham calls the place, "The Lord will provide." And on this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time, and he said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed there. Now sometime later, Abraham was told that Milcah is a mother. Milcah had borne sons to your brother Nahor, Uz the firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel, the father of Aram, Kesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlap, and Bethuel. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. Milcah bore these 8 sons to Abraham's brother Nahor, his concubine, whose name was Reumah. Reumah. Also his sons Teba, Gaham, Tahash, and Makah. Oh, that's a lot of names to go through, and we don't really need to pay attention to any of them. Well, except for one of them, the Bethuel guy. But, anyway. That is chapter 22. And chapter 22 is a very interesting chapter. Every Christian will tell you, this is like one of the big moments in Genesis. And it is like, the arc, the climax of the Abraham arc. So, I mean, it's a solid reason to think that. And it is here that Abraham sees something beyond the human experience, if you will, right? Because, I've been joking throughout this whole thing about how, like, Abraham kind of fumbles his way through life. And as we read in the other chapters, that's apparently what's going on, right? Abraham kind of fumbles his way through life. But here, Abraham sees so much more because God reveals himself in a way, as God, if you will, as opposed to, like, before there would be scenes where God, like, hangs out with Abraham, but they're more like just being buddies kind of thing. But here, God shows himself in a powerful way to Abraham. And, this is, what changes basically everything, and showing the nature of who God is, right? I mean, we obviously get hints of this as, like, he humanizes Abraham a lot in the story. But here we kind of see the transcendent side of God, if you will. Because we see, one of the funny things is that, like, in Genesis, there's a big focus on how human God is at a lot of times. Even though and maybe the audience, maybe we as the reader, may have kind of got caught in that too, right? A lot of the earlier chapters in Genesis humanize God a lot, so that we tend to forget that he's also the same guy, in Genesis 1, right? The same guy who created the universe with his words, right? He's that same guy. And so a lot of people may think, well, where does this happen in this story? Because the story is about, the famous binding of Isaac. And so, how do I put this? So, even though, I guess we get my hot take of the week, this scene starts off with God behaving very much like, kind of messing with Abraham. He's actually kind of, when God gives him this command to sacrifice Isaac, God is actually messing with him. And this is kind of like, the reap what you sow kind of thing, right? Or, Eastern religions call it the karma moment, right? Where Abraham's going to get what's coming to him because he's deceived a lot of people. He's not a nice guy. He's a filthy liar that tries to worm his way out of his own problems, right? And so God decides to kind of mess around with him a little bit. And so if you actually read in this line, and another thing too is that you have to understand the ancient culture of the Middle Eastern world, which actually gives you a much wider view of why God does what he does in this scene. Because if you don't really look into like the larger context, I've seen many of Christians fall into this pitfall where people may challenge, non-Christians challenge Christians on like, well, why did God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? Wouldn't that be a contradiction in the Bible? Is God changed? Is he double-minded? Does he change his mind? And many Christians actually sometimes don't know how to answer this. But if you understand the larger view of the larger context, the story is actually very played out, straightforward, and not to mention, you have to look at the Abraham arc as a whole, right? So my hot take, if you will, I guess it's a hot take because I know I'm gonna go a little bit beyond what is simply at face value, but it's also dangerous to read chapter 22. Excuse me. It's also dangerous to read chapter 22 alone. So the big arc that's going on in the Abraham arc is that Abraham is learning to really trust God, right? And that is the big challenge of any person, right? To really trust God. Now, I did mention back with Ishmael that, Abraham was starting to build some of that, right? That Abraham believed God there, that God would take care of Ishmael. And so Abraham listened to his wife. But here, Abraham really has to be pushed to see how much he trusts God. But what Abraham doesn't know, and what we as the readers know in hindsight, is that God all along had no intentions of actually having Isaac hurt at all. He had no intentions. But rather, God wanted to show Abraham the kind of person he actually is. Now, this is where I would say that you have to actually have a good understanding of Middle Eastern culture, and of course, the Bible's wider narrative of why Israel is always in conflict with other nations. So before, some people say, well, Scripture interprets Scripture, and then they use certain passages where like, but Abraham believed God would raise him from the dead. But that's Abraham's fault of not knowing God at the time, right? That Abraham just had to assume something like that. But the bigger picture, when you look at the context, and once again, I'm trying to read Genesis mainly within the Pentateuch context. So when I say the Pentateuch context, that's the first 5 books, the Mosaic tradition, right? Believed to be written by Moses. So in the books of the law, there's a lot of laws in the Bible that is against child abuse, because the whole idea was that when Israel was moving to the land of Canaan, the Canaanites and other neighboring groups were believed to be really awful people, in that they would do things like sacrifice children to their gods or whatever. And this is something we must actually consider in this story, because as I pointed out in chapter 18 and was making fun of Abraham for acting without thinking, and Abraham feeds God milk and meat, which according to Jewish law, and they would have had the Mosaic audience, the early Hebrews, they would have known this law because Moses would have told them. And then you tell them a story about God, and you tell them about the founder of Israel. Well, one of the founders of, sorry, not Israel, founder of the Hebrew people. I should be correct in my wording. founder of the Hebrew people. And Abraham feeds God something that violates the law. So here, in the same way, now God is going to troll Abraham and pretend to violate his own law, according to the audience as they would have understood it, right? Because if the Hebrew people would have known the law, you don't sacrifice your children like the Canaanites do to their gods Molech and whoever, right? You don't do that, right? A child is not, you don't kill your kids like that. And so in the beginning of chapter 22, it's supposed to put this moment to the Hebrew audience, just like Abraham feeding God milk and meat. But of course, in chapter 18, it was meant to show that God really humanized Abraham despite his idiocy, right? But here, now the audience may think, well, why would God violate his own law, right? Because it was one thing for Abraham to do it. Abraham doesn't know about it, right? He doesn't know anything. But why would God apparently contradict his own law? And this is a big question that needs to be brought up, because that is the main point of this story, right? And to show what God is really going to do and what God plans to do with humanity as a whole. That more transcendent side, if you will, as opposed to, God just being Abraham's homeboy for a while. So this is an interesting thing, because another thing to assume with the context, as I just explained in the Mosaic context, if Abraham, who also comes from these places, that sacrifice kids to Molech and other gods, then in a way, and this is where some people would say, well, why would Abraham listen to this command to sacrifice his son, right? Like Abraham's like over 100, he's like probably near 120 years old. Why would he listen to this ridiculous command from God, right? To kill your only son. Like, you just went your whole life trying to have this kid, and now you got to kill him? Like, what gives? And so, but at the same time, in the ancient culture, that would have been expected. That would not have mattered, right? Because Molech demands a child sacrifice. So who cares if it spent your whole life to get a kid? Molech demands it. So Abraham would have thought like these ancient people, because he's actually a product from them, which is also why he's a pretty terrible person, right? It's also why he feeds God milk and meat, right? He violates the law. Well, it's another reason why Abraham lies his way out of everything, right? It's a reason why Abraham's a total failure in life too, right? He has to marry his cousin, basically half sister / cousin. It's really weird in the ancient world. They're like, she's basically a relatively close family member. So, anyway, I'm surprised there's no incest jokes coming from you guys. I know you guys get off on that. So anyway, back to Abraham, but that would not have mattered. If God says it, you do it. So Abraham goes up the hill, right, and he takes his son Isaac along. And the other funny thing is that Isaac, like, people always joke about, like, did Isaac suspect anything? Like, he's carrying up the wood, he's carrying up, it's just him and his dad going up this hill, and his dad's got a fire and a knife. Was he not suspicious of anything, right? But once again, it shows that the reason why Isaac doesn't suspect anything and Abraham just goes ahead with this idea is because Abraham and, by extension, Isaac are stuck in the old ways. They're stuck in that old world before, in the old ways before there was the fear of God, right? Which is an interesting why you have to look back at the other stories, though. So I'm going to backtrack a bit, and you'll kind of see how this plays out. So I already talked about how, like, Abraham's a filthy liar, so God's going to kind of pay him, his dues for being a filthy liar. So that's why God kind of trolls him at the beginning. Then there's the whole, like, why Abraham actually goes with the order of sacrifice your son. because Abraham, despite believing that Abimelech has no fear of God, Abraham himself does not have a real fear of God. And part of that is because he's old, so he's kind of set in his ways. And secondly, Abraham, like the audience, would have been too comfortable with the humanizing of God, right? So many times God humanizes himself by humanizing other people, right? And he makes himself more human that way. And so, we read in Abraham's story that God does this a lot with Abraham. He just like goes to his tent one day, just like, yo, let's go take a walk outside, let's hang out, right? And stuff like that. Like God just does this. And so, like the audience, Abraham has gotten too comfortable with God acting in a very human way and not like God, right? So when Abraham doesn't suspect anything, he's thinking like, oh, this is just a casual thing that God wants me to do because this is how we've always done things, right? And that's how, homeboys do it for homeboys, right? So that's why he doesn't suspect and why he just carries out the order, right, to go sacrifice his son. And then, of course, Isaac doesn't suspect because Isaac is actually, despite Abraham being out of the old life for so long, he still is part of that old, Canaan and even, surrounding nations, the godless people, if you will, their tradition. And so if Isaac was to be sacrificed, he would have just accepted it, right? He'd be like, yeah, whatever, right? And so, because that's his lot in life, right? If Molech demands child sacrifice, well, sorry, buddy, you're out of luck, right? So let's move further back now. So there's the whole Abimelech thing, and then of course, let's go to the Sodom and Gomorrah story for a moment and backtrack a bit there, and well, more of the part of Abraham bargaining with God, right? So there's this dynamic that Abraham understands that he has with God, right? Because when Abraham tries to bargain with God, he knows that he really can't, but he does it anyway. And so when God asks him something this ridiculous, Abraham feels obliged to because he keeps that in mind as well. He knows that, well, I've overstepped my boundaries with God. So if God, even though this might overstep his boundaries with me, well, it's only fair because I've already done it to God, right? So Abraham is looking at things in a fair trade, even if this was to be a problem for Abraham, because the Bible goes out of its way when God says, take your son Isaac whom you love, right? So it's meant to be a big deal that, you're going to kill your son, but he's not just your son. He is like your most treasured possession, right? But because Abraham understood, he already pushed boundaries, if you will, with God. Even if God were to, this is Abraham's thinking. So because I violated, God's boundaries, if he were to violate mine, I have to be okay with it because that's only fair, right? So they go up the hill and they get there, and Abraham, and this is the other funny thing too, like, once again, Isaac does nothing, right? He's like so passive in the whole story. Like, his dad ties him up and then puts him on the bundle of wood, the thing they're gonna light on fire. And so, and Isaac does nothing. He does nothing the whole time. And so, you know, I don't know, I always found that part always ridiculous. That Isaac just takes it, right? Like, this poor guy. So, Isaac's lying there, and Abraham's about to stab him, right? And this is where, like, the big revelation moment comes in, right? And then Abraham's about to stab him, or cut his throat or whatever, however you let blood out of somebody. So, and make sure they die, because you want them to die pretty quickly, right? So it's probably like about to slit his throat or something. And then God or the angel stops him. Of course, once again, this problematic angel of the Lord character, because he acts like God, and so many people believe that like this is actually Jesus himself now, because he acts like God and like the way he talks and the way he claims authority, like I will do this, I will do that, right? And so the angel shows up and he's like, "Yo, Abraham, like stop, right? Don't hurt him, don't you touch him, right?" And then he says, "Now I know that you won't withhold from me, but at the same time, if you read chapter 15, God already knew that that was not necessary for Abraham. Abraham didn't have to do any of this because God had already fulfilled the covenant." And this is where a lot of people actually miss the mark sometimes when they try to understand this story. See, when the angel here talks, and I'm going to actually read that part again. He talks about how that. Okay. There, it's verse 15. "And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord." So there's that whole, this angel acts like he's God. "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars. Your descendants will take possession of the city of their enemies, blah, blah, blah. And all nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." And then they went and set off for Beersheba. So the angel is basically saying like, hey, I have seen you now. And I know that, you know, you've learned something from this. And this is what I hope you learn. And so the angel, acting like God here, so this is why everybody thinks he's Jesus. The way he behaves, and it's one of those things that it's hard to just tell by text alone. But the angel is kind of like, I see you, but why? And the thing the angel was pointing out was that this was unnecessary. Okay? This was unnecessary because the fact of the matter is, you know, the angel was already going to bless him. And so the reason why I have to talk about this is because many Christians, when they talk about this passage, about like, oh, the revolutionary part, they tend to skip over these important details to get to the next part. Because a lot of people the conclusion is right, but it's kind of like, the analogy I use is like, you know, when you're doing like a math test and you have to solve like a certain word problem, and then it says like, show your work. Well, many Christians put the right answer but don't show their work. So here I'm showing my work. And I already talked about the whole Abimelech thing, the Sodom and Gomorrah. You got to think of all these different things. Now, there's one passage I actually like to focus on, and I did talk about this a while back when I read this passage, and it's actually chapter 15. Now, chapter 15 is actually a very important passage in relation to this one. And chapter 15 is the scene where Abraham and God do God first sets up the covenant, right? The whole, I will give you a son and he will be like the star, like his descendants will be like the stars and all that, right? Which is brought up again here in chapter 22. Now, the funny thing about that scene is that God he participates in a very human ritual, because once again, God humanizes Abraham, right? So he plays along, if you will, where Abraham and God do this, like they cut some animals in half, and it's part of an old Middle Eastern tradition of like, basically it was a business contract, and the idea was, if you don't fill your end of the contract, you are like this dead animal, was basically the idea. And God decides to play along. Which is the interesting contrast in chapter 15 and chapter 22, is that in chapter 22, he doesn't need to do that part anymore. He just says, I swear on my word, right? And this is the whole like God being more transcendent as opposed to being more human, right? So in chapter 15, God behaves in a human way. He participates in a human ritual. He plays along. But here, you know, the angel, who many scholars would believe that this ends up being, many Christian scholars, I should say, believe ends up being Jesus, because he swears it on himself now and says that, okay, you know, you have to remember chapter 15 when we did that whole thing. Oh yeah, you were sleeping half the time, Abraham. You don't remember. You were sleeping half the time. Because remember in chapter 15 when they cut the animals and they were supposed to light the thing on light the bodies on the animal bodies on fire. But Abraham, he's like sending birds away to make sure they don't, you know, eat the bodies. And then Abraham falls asleep and then God shows up with the fire and he lights both sides. And so, you know, Abraham, you know, in that scene, it's like God plays along for a little while, but then he decides that, okay, I'm done playing. And if you will, God's like, I'm getting serious now, right? Because God is serious about his promise to Abraham. And so he's like, I'm getting serious now. So you don't have to fill your side of the bargain because I will fulfill both sides. And of course, this is where the whole Isaac thing is important, right? Because Isaac is his son whom he loves. And of course, that language is important because this is gospel language, right? You know, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, right? That God is saying that you don't have to fulfill that sacrifice. You don't have to give up what you value. Or at least in the sense of your son. You don't have to give him up. Because in your old way of, if you're in your old way of thinking, in Abraham's old way of thinking, when he had to lie his way out of everything, and where, you know, he felt like he had to get even at times with people and all that stuff. You don't have to think like that anymore, because God will provide for you. God is the one who's going to lead your life and bless you. And this was the point God was trying to get across to him the entire time, but doesn't actually really get it across to Abraham till here, right? And Abraham finally learns it, which is kind of what's actually being said in the last part that the angel is telling him. And of course, the angel now says, officially, I will swear on my word alone, because that is good enough for you, right? Because this is where, and every Christian will talk about this, how like, yes, we can trust God because of his word, right? And his word is good enough for us. Well, where does that come from? Where does that idea come from? Right? It comes from here. It comes from this story. And how, you know, and this story begins, you know, the gospel story, if you will, right? That God is going to send his son as a contrast to Abraham sacrificing his son. And many Christians talk about the quote unquote Christ typology, uh, where basically Isaac is a type of Christ in this scene, and is like, you know, Isaac is supposed to be the sacrificial lamb, but not really, because God says, well, no human being can do it. No ordinary human anyway, right? And not some brainless kid like Isaac, that's for sure. So, no ordinary human being will ever fulfill the duty God is going to fulfill, right? And so, that's why the angel swears it on himself here in this scene. He says, well, I, on my word, will fulfill the promise I've given to you. And your offspring, singular, as Paul will talk about in Galatians, your offspring, singular, will bless all nations, right? And this is the whole covenant of Jesus covenant, right? That Jesus will bring salvation to all people. And so the contrast here is, you know, God, he will provide the way on his own because he's God. And we would, and in a way, we kind of expect him to, right? If he is who he says he is, right? And I think that's one of the things that's really beautiful about this chapter, in chapter 22, is understand that, like, you know, God will not require, like, even though the wages of sin is death, he does not have to require our blood for it. But the gospel message is God had already provided that offering, the need of the blood, because sin demand, the wages of sin is death. When we, all of us who have sinned, including Abraham, as we have clearly seen, not a nice guy, but God does not demand his blood or his son's blood, despite all of Abraham's failings. He does not demand him his blood or his son's blood, which would have been the common practice in the old ways, right? Well, if you die, that's the end of your life. So how do you atone for your sin while you staying alive? Well, kill your kids. That was the old way of thinking, which is crazy and idiotic, and you can see why it's a problem, right? So, but God is saying, I'm not like that. I won't ask that of you. I don't have to, because on my word, I will provide you a way, and that way later became Jesus, right? And that's another reason why Jesus says, I am the way, right? The way to the Father, right? No one comes to the Father except through me, right? That is this. Jesus taught about exactly this scene, right? When he brings that up, I am the way, right? Because this is how, the oath God makes to man and the promise he will carry out far later from Abraham's time, because Abraham's like a couple thousand years before Jesus. But the promise is made that on my word, and this is where God flips from being like homeboy, if you will, to being God and all, because he's God and all that, right? So he's gonna own up to that and say, hey, that covenant that we made, I will fulfill it. Of course, that, of course, with that being, all that being said, though, the thing that we can't become complacent about that, right? Because God has provided, that's true. But at the same time, we must also come to accept Jesus and believe, right? Because Jesus says, well, sure, I did all this, but it doesn't mean anything. Like, what does that mean to you? Does that actually mean anything to you? Do you believe because of what I've done, right? And that's the other side of the coin. But I mean, that's every Christian message in a nutshell. So, do you believe because of what God has done? But I think reading Genesis 22 is super important because, of course we have to look at it like on hindsight. We know God has already done what he says he will do. So prophecy fulfilled and all that. But, when you read Genesis, you got to see as like God is going to do this. And of course, the big build up through the rest of the Bible, until, the rest of this thing, until you get to the New Testament, right, is the build up of how God is going to get there. Who is going to come along? How is God going to bring that salvation, right? And free people from their old life, if you will, right? And this is where like the New Testament uses the whole like Paul uses the whole like old man, new man language. It comes from this context, right? Because Abraham's like an old ass 120-year-old guy. Isaac is probably a young adult, late teens, young adult, something like that. Right? Now, at this late point, because when Abraham started this whole journey, he was like 70 years old. But now God is saying, now is the time I'm going to do something with you, which is weird to go about it that way. But hey, God does whatever he wants. But when you read chapter 22, you got to keep all those other contexts in mind to understand that like the larger reality of, a lot of Christians, they just talk about how like, well, Isaac was a type of Jesus. Well, how so, right? And is he really? Because it's not about what Abraham or Isaac can do. It's about what God is going to do. Well, at least in the context of chapter 22, right? The context of chapter 22 is what is God going to do? And of course, I mean, on hindsight, we know that it's give his son, right? And God gives himself in surrendering his son, right? That he does it himself. He does not demand from us our blood, but he gives his own through his son. And that is supposed to be the profound moment that Abraham finally realizes. And something that, as we read through this story, that's something that would empower us to, faith. Because that's where faith comes from, right? It's is to know that reality of what God has done, right? And what God is going to do in the case of chapter 22. But of course, this is where the compelling power of the gospel comes in, and the Spirit constantly reminds us that, God has already done, he has fulfilled this on his word. And it's interesting that the wording is there, right? On my word. Because of course, this is why in the book of John, the logos thing is a huge deal, right? That this promise became flesh. In the person of Jesus Christ. And that is something that we all have access to when we trust in God, just like Abraham had to. And that's the reason why this story is so profound. So, hopefully, to my other fellow Christians, show your work when you explain this passage, because I have seen many Christians fail at it, and the results can be devastating. So, show your work, guys. But chapter 22 is so profound on so many levels because of that. And of course, you have to look at chapter 22 in the light of the rest of the Abraham story, right? Because chapter 22 is the climax of that, right? It took the guy 11 chapters, more or less, to get here, right? And like 50 years, basically, right? So, something to always keep in mind. And why chapter 22 is great. And why many people, I showed every step of not every step, but a lot of my work, if you will, of why many Christians, or me explaining why many Christians view chapter 22 as so profound. But I want to make sure that you guys see all the different dimensions, as opposed to because it is. Because another reason why I want to explain this thoroughly is also, as we tell these stories to non-Christians, I hate using that word. But to non-Christians, this story is a big part of the gospel message, and you got to explain it fully and all the implications and why it matters, right? And those things are sometimes I find that people are lacking when they explain this. So I just felt like I needed to explain it well. Anyway, that was a mouthful. We're almost done the Abraham arc because there's kind of like a little epilogue that we're gonna read about. Well, there's actually 2 more chapters with Abraham. So let's try and oh my goodness, it's like, well, the problem is that where do I go with this? Abraham. I'm just looking at some notes here. I just want to read some stuff. I just want to check some notes here. Yeah, so basically the reason why I'm probably gonna, this is kind of like the end of the Abraham arc. There's Abraham actually has a longer epilogue than I thought, because his epilogue bleeds into the beginning of the Isaac arc, and I kind of want to do the Isaac arc as its own thing, because Isaac's arc is actually not that long. He actually has a pretty short arc, but the reason why his seems so short is because a lot of it is also like Abraham's epilogue. But I'll only read part of it. because I'm just reading the end of Isaac's arc, which is like chapter 26. So let's see, how many chapters? One, 2, 3. Yeah, it's like next week's stream will be kind of short because it's only 3 chapters in Isaac's arc, and then we get to, you know, the quote unquote true founder, if you will, of the Hebrews / Israel, and I will use that wording because Jacob counts as the founder of Israel. Abraham not so much because he's like, you know, the patriarch of several other people as well. But Jacob in particular is like the founder of Israel and the Hebrews. And then of course Isaac is kind of, you know, the in between, right? So I'll only read one more chapter because the next part kind of like, even though it's not exactly about Isaac, and it does start with like Abraham in the story, it's still mainly about Isaac because it kind of builds up the world for Isaac and the kind of stuff he has to deal with. But anyway, that's kind of the plan. I've been reading for just under 2 hours, reading / commentating for like just shy of 2 hours. So after I finish chapter 23, which actually isn't that long, and the commentary is probably not that long either, we'll go to just about 2 hours, and then short Q&A or something if you have questions, and then I will end the stream from there. So here's the little epilogue of the Abraham arc, starting with, well, basically chapter 23. Now Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. When Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites, he said, I am a foreigner and stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here, so I can bury my dead. The Hittites replied to Abraham, Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you this tomb for burying your dead. Then Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land. And he said to them, If you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf. So he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, I think that's how you say that, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you. Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of his city. No, my lord, he said. Now you listen to me. I give you the field. I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. So go and bury your dead. Again Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in their hearing, Listen to me if you will. I will pay the full price. Accept it from me so that I can bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham again, Listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed to Ephron's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So Ephron's field in Machpelah, near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of the field, was deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron. in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. Melody Tong, thank you for your Bible study lesson. Well, thank you for coming. Anyway, this is the end of chapter 23. So I'm going to do a quick commentary on this one. Because like I said, it's an epilogue, right? And it kind of shows the end of the Abraham arc. So this is how I know, based on what the Bible says, about how Abraham learned something from God at the end of chapter 22. So as I was talking about in chapter 22, the big reveal, if you will, is that God was basically saying, hey, I'm going to provide everything for you and how to take care of you and to ensure your, not just your physical life, but your spiritual life, which is more implied, the spiritual life part, because of course the Hebrew understanding was that like all of it was holistic in the sense of like your body. And this is why the law is laid out the way it is, right? You love God with your heart, your heart, soul, and strength, right? So your heart was closely, like in the ancient world, the heart and mind were close together, and that like it's your thinking being, your soul is your transcending spirit being, and then your body, your strength as well, your body, right? So and the reason why the law is laid out that way is because all three of them are kind of in tandem. So when you look at your life, you're supposed to view all those things as one thing. Your mind is not separated from your soul, and your soul is not separated from your body. They all exist in tandem. So when I talk about like the whole thing here with like when God's providing Abraham's life, I mean that in the whole sense. And the spiritual side is, of course, Jesus and all that, right? But we'll get, that's far in the future, so don't think about that too much right now. But like back with, God teaching Abraham this lesson about how, God will provide everything for Abraham, and Abraham is kind of like off the hook, if you will, right? Of course, God does put other conditions later about like, well, you have to believe, because if you don't believe, then I can't do anything for you. And two, you got to keep living up to, you got to at least try to live up to my word, because I've given you the powers to do so, right? And so, God gives human beings, he's restored more of our magical nature, if you will, in that we are empowered to live out his commands. That's what Jesus talks about at the end of the Gospels, right? That the Spirit will come and empower you to do these things. But anyway, that's besides the point. So Abraham he's learned this from God, that God is the provider of his spiritual self through, and of course the blood offering that it is required of Abraham, and God will provide that. So what Abraham shows how he knows that he's learned this is in this chapter, and why chapter 23 is kind of like a weird subject matter. It's like about Sarah's death, but like we actually see how Abraham has actually learned something from God after all this time. And so it's this awkward, like he tries to say like, no, I am going to buy the grave site from you, and Ephron's like, no, bro, don't worry about it, and then Abraham's like, no, I'm going to buy it at full price. And everyone's like, nah, man, don't worry about it, right? And then Abraham's like, for the last effing time, I'm buying it at the full price. The silver's here, and you're going to take it. Because if I'm going to do something, I'm going to honor my word. And that is something Abraham has learned. Because remember, back in the beginning, Abraham is anything but honorable with his words, right? He's a filthy liar. But, here, Abraham is very adamant about honoring his word. And that's how he continues to live like God, right? And so that's kind of the big takeaway from chapter 23. It's kind of unfortunate that Sarah gets refrigerated, is the literary term for it. The woman in the fridge motif. It's an ugly motif, but I might as well just address it. So the woman in the fridge is kind of the idea that some female character gets the shaft, and it's usually post-mortem, and they're usually used to push a male character into the spotlight. This is used in a lot of literature. Comic books are guilty of this a lot, actually, of like woman in the fridge motif. Unfortunately, the Bible did it first. So oof. Um you just gotta take it, guys. You just have to accept that it's in the Bible, right? The Bible records crazy events. Woman in the fridge. I guess here's our biblical woman in the fridge. Oof. So basically, Sarah's kind of just used as like to just elevate Abraham's character and how he's grown and the kind of person that he is, right? Because Abraham's like 135. He's about 135 now, roughly, right? Because it says that Sarah dies at 127. Do the math. He's 10 years older than her, which also means that Isaac is like in his 30s. Because Isaac is actually a little bit of a failure too in that. Well, I hate to say it this way because I'm almost the same age as Isaac. He's not married. Oh no! But not being, Isaac not being married and in his like late 30s. Oh no. Oh no. But but the Bible doesn't paint Isaac as a failure like it does with Abraham. But that's besides the point. But anyway, the point is that, Abraham took this long. He's almost twice as old as when he started this whole journey to finally get it, right? To finally understand the kind of person God is. That when God says he's going to do something, he honors it fully. And so that's something that, we must learn to do. And it ain't easy, right? I mean, Abraham's case in point, right? He's been walking around with God for like almost 70 years. Takes the guy that long to finally get this basic lesson, right? Or quote unquote basic lesson. But it sounds easy on paper, but it's actually really hard to do. I mean, that's true with most of the commands in the Bible, right? They sound easy to do, but they're like really hard to actually do. But chapter 23, it shows that Abraham is a changed person and he understands the nature of God and what is at the core of God, and that is the truth that God cannot lie. Well, that's one of the major parts, but at least in Abraham's context, that's the most important because remember, Abraham's a filthy liar in the beginning of his story, and here he's like, a man of his word and so adamant about his word that even when Ephron's just like, yo, dude, like, you don't have to pay me anything. Abraham's like, no, I said I'm going to do it. I said I'm going to do it, so I'm going to do it, damn it. So that's Abraham's story in a nutshell. And this is kind of the end of his arc. Even though Abraham is around a little bit longer, the next chapter actually has more to do with Isaac than it does with Abraham, even though Abraham's kind of like the starter of the story. But I guess you could say he's kind of handing the baton off. And then Isaac has like a few chapters. Because Isaac is actually like, despite being like this, the whole thing with like Abraham's story is about Isaac and the coming of Isaac. But at the same time, Isaac doesn't actually do very much. But anyway, we'll read about that next week. So, with that being said, I think I'm going to finish the reading stream here because I can't really keep reading without going to the next arc. And if I start the Isaac arc, I have to go through the whole way. And because Isaac's arc isn't actually that long, it's only like a few chapters. So I might as well just do all of those chapters in one stream and talk about him. And he's kind of an interesting character, but I mean, Abraham has way more content, and so does Jacob. So Isaac is kind of like this midway point. But save for that, it's not much to. I mean, there's still parts to analyze about him, and of course about Rebecca, she's actually the more interesting character. At least that's how I look at it. I think Rebecca is a very interesting character, and in a way, even though it's the Isaac arc, it's really more Rebecca arc. So there's my little hot take. There's my other hot take. It's the Rebecca arc that we'll be coming on to next week. Because I mean, you have to do all her stuff in one in one stream. It's its own stream is what I meant to say. I don't want to cram it here after 2 hours of the end of the Abraham arc, and then have to cram in another like 2 hours for Rebecca and Isaac. So with that being said, I'm going to end the stream here. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to me ramble on and overanalyze the Bible, because that's what I do. But, you know, I do this to help you guys and hopefully to build up your faith and for you to know your faith. That's kind of the main reason why I do this, is for you to know what you believe and to really conceptualize it. Because it's not that you don't know these things. I'm not saying you're stupid. It's not that you don't know these things, but it is always helpful to have a guy who knows how to put those things into words. And that's what I feel is my purpose, is to put things you know into words. Because just because you know something doesn't mean you know how to express it. I mean, there's an old saying I remember someone telling me this, and it was, the way you evaluate how well you know something is how well you can teach it to someone else. And so that's where I like to believe that, like, well, I can help you guys in knowing, you know, knowing your faith and knowing the Bible by helping you put things you already know and vaguely understand into words. And so I hope I was able to help in that regard. And I hope that, you know, all the other stuff that I mentioned, you know, that would mean something to you and you find ways to apply in your own life. You're more than smart enough to figure that out. But with that being said, this is the end of the stream. Just some short announcements before I close the stream is next week stream schedule. I just want to kind of talk about this. I gotta sort out some stuff with my buddy Taki for more Halloween edition stuff. Even though, yes, I know Halloween is tomorrow, so technically Halloween's over. But technically, and I will actually, I wish I could have talked about this on Wednesday's stream. But if you actually understand the origins of Halloween, Halloween and the Spirit Festival, if you will, actually goes for several weeks. And Halloween and All Saints Day, or All Hallows Day, which the Catholic Church renamed it to All Saints Day, technically is the middle. So we're technically in the middle of the Spirit Festival in that regard. And so it's fair game to do Halloween streams in November. So, I got you there. So with that being said, there will be a couple of Halloween streams next week. At least one. I just got started some stuff with Taki. And then that might be Monday and Wednesday. That's my plan. But once again, I got to check with him about it. And then, of course, there's going to be a Throwback Thursday. I'm going to be studying StarCraft Brood War because I finished the original StarCraft yesterday. And, of course, next Friday, we're going to have another reading stream talking about the Rebecca and Isaac arc. And I'm definitely going to refer to it more as the Rebecca arc because, honestly, she's the more interesting character. But with that being said, I hope you have a good day. The good rest of your day. Have a wonderful Halloween weekend. Have fun with it. You know, Halloween is also a great time for evangelism. So there's that, which is another reason why I'm not around tomorrow. I mean, I normally don't stream on the week. I don't stream on the weekends anyway, but I'm definitely not around tomorrow because I'll be doing some stuff for Halloween. Some Bible handout, and basically do what I do here, except in real life. So stuff like that. So anyway, you have a great Halloween weekend. Have a good night.